They say the courtroom is where truth speaks. But that day, truth was silent. Only her voice filled the air, confident, calm, and cruel. Every lie she told was a nail in someone else's coffin. And the man she accused? He sat there broken, yet watching her closely. He didn't speak. He didn't defend. He simply stared, as if waiting. Because he knew something she didn't. The face behind the gavel wasn't just a judge. It was a ghost from her past, one she had buried with lies long ago. And today, her past was ready to speak for itself. But before I continue, make sure you're subscribed to the Revenge by Sophia channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We love to see how far our stories travel. Rachel stood before her mirror, repeating her lines for the 10th time. The room was silent except for her voice, steady, smooth, and rehearsed to perfection. Her reflection stared back like a stranger, eyes hollow yet determined. Every sentence she spoke had been shaped carefully, every tear she planned to shed already timed in her mind. She whispered, "He deserves this," though deep inside, even she didn't believe it anymore. The air in the apartment felt heavy, filled with perfume and pretense, the scent of someone who had learned to hide guilt behind elegance. When her phone buzzed with a message from her lawyer saying, "See you in court at 10, she smiled faintly. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Was it fear? Or excitement? Even she couldn't tell anymore. Morning sunlight bled through the blinds as she walked into the courthouse, heels echoing sharply against the marble floor. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered her name, Rachel Monroe, the brave woman testifying against a dangerous man. But behind her calm expression, panic moved like smoke beneath her skin. Every corner of the courtroom seemed to watch her. Even the portraits of old judges looked disapproving. Her lawyer leaned in and said quietly, "Just stick to the script. They'll believe you." She nodded, taking a deep breath, her eyes briefly meeting the man sitting at the defendant's table, Michael. His face looked drained, defeated, and yet there was something in his stare. Something that said he knew. As she took her seat at the witness stand, her heartbeat echoed in her ears, loud as a ticking clock. Would her lies sound as convincing as they did in the mirror? The prosecutor's voice sliced through the silence. "Ms. Monroe, can you tell the court what happened that night?" Rachel looked down at her hands, perfectly still, then up at the jury. She let her voice tremble just slightly. "He came to my house. He was angry. I tried to calm him down, but he—" She paused, letting her breath catch. "He hurt me." The courtroom gasped softly. Every word she said was carefully chosen, like poison disguised as honey. She could feel Michael's eyes on her, heavy and unblinking, as if each lie she spoke was carving his name deeper into a grave he didn't dig. But when she glanced toward the judge, something froze her heart. He wasn't looking at her testimony, he was looking at her. And there was something familiar in his eyes, a face she thought she'd never see again. Michael sat quietly in the defendant's chair, his wrists resting on the wooden edge of the table as if even gravity felt heavier today. His once confident face now carried the stillness of someone who had already accepted ruin. The whispers from the crowd brushed against him like cold wind, each one repeating lies he could no longer correct. His lawyer murmured something about staying calm, but Michael barely heard it. The sound of Rachel's voice was all that existed. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she twisted them, turning their past into a weapon. Every sentence was a knife dipped in false tears. He stared at her, trying to find a trace of the woman he once loved, but all he saw was a stranger wearing her skin. Was she always this good at pretending, or did pain make her perfect at it? As Rachel continued speaking, Michael's mind drifted backward, to the night everything burned. The small apartment they once shared smelled of lavender and coffee, but that night it had smelled of betrayal. He remembered her eyes, cold and sharp, as she packed her bags after the argument. "You'll regret this," she'd said, her voice trembling not from fear, but from rage. The next morning, the police came. His name was everywhere. Fraud, theft, assault, crimes he never committed, but ones that fit too perfectly to fight. The city believed her. Everyone did. Now, sitting in the courtroom, he realized how fragile truth could be when wrapped in a pretty voice. He clenched his hands under the table, feeling the edge of his cuff dig into his wrist. He had already lost everything. So why was the judge staring at her like that? Michael lifted his eyes toward the bench, watching the judge closely. The man hadn't spoken much since the hearing began, just calm nods and short remarks. But there was something strange in his silence. His eyes followed Rachel's every movement, not with authority, but with recognition, as though he was remembering something only he knew. For a moment, the judge's pen stopped tapping. His jaw tightened. Michael's pulse quickened, unsure whether it was hope or fear creeping through him. The judge finally looked away, flipping a document, pretending to focus. Michael leaned closer to his lawyer and whispered, "Do you know who he is?" The lawyer shook his head. "New appointment. Strict but fair. Fair." That word felt like a cruel joke. Still, a thought began to flicker in Michael's mind. Faint, dangerous, and full of questions. Why did the judge look at Rachel like that? As if her lies weren't new to him? The courtroom felt colder now. Even the air seemed to hesitate before moving. Rachel adjusted the microphone, her voice steady again, but her gaze kept drifting, just slightly, toward the man behind the gavel. The judge. His expression was unreadable, carved in calm authority, yet his eyes. They didn't look like a stranger's. There was something hauntingly familiar in them, like a half-remembered dream pressing against the edge of her memory. Every time she looked his way, her heartbeat skipped, though she couldn't explain why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was recognition she refused to face. He tilted his head once, just slightly, and their eyes met. It lasted only a second. But to Rachel, it felt like time stopped. Where have I seen him before? She thought. And why does he look at me like he already knows the truth? The prosecutor continued questioning, his tone sharp, his papers rustling like whispers of accusation. But Rachel barely heard him now. The silence between her and the judge spoke louder. Every so often his gaze would lift, calm, observing, dissecting her every reaction. When she hesitated on a date or stumbled over a word, his brow twitched ever so slightly as if confirming a suspicion. It wasn't the gaze of a man hearing a new story. It was the gaze of someone remembering an old one. The courtroom clock ticked, slow, deliberate, merciless. Michael noticed it too. His eyes darted from Rachel to the judge, reading the invisible tension hanging between them. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced, his stare unbroken, and though he said nothing, Rachel could almost feel the words behind his silence. "I know who you are." Her hands trembled slightly as she took a sip of water. The glass clinked against the wood, the sound echoing far too loud in the still room. The judge flipped through her testimony, slowly, methodically, before pausing at a single page. "Ms. Monroe," he said, voice calm but cutting, "you mentioned an incident 5 years ago involving a business partner, correct?" Rachel froze. "That wasn't supposed to come up." "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, forcing a smile. "But it's irrelevant to this case." The judge nodded. "Perhaps," he murmured, his tone colder now. "But sometimes, the past has a strange way of becoming relevant again." Her heart thudded against her ribs. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls inching closer. She tried to steady her breathing, but her thoughts were spinning. 5 years ago, she thought. Could he possibly know about that? The judge turned a page, his expression unreadable. But his next words, quiet and deliberate, made her blood run cold. "Let's not pretend the past doesn't follow us." "Ms. Monroe." Rachel's heart pounded as the judge's words echoed inside her head. The past has a strange way of becoming relevant again. For the first time, her perfect mask began to crack. The fluorescent courtroom lights seemed harsher now, burning against her skin like interrogation lamps. She blinked, but her vision blurred, not from tears but from panic. That phrase, that tone. It pulled her backward, into memories she'd spent years burying. 5 years ago, there had been another courtroom. Another lie. Another man destroyed by her ambition. She remembered his voice, desperate, trembling. "You're making a mistake, Rachel." But she hadn't cared. Back then, she told herself it was survival, that he was weak. that she was only doing what she had to do. Now, as the judge's cold eyes watched her, it felt like her sins had finally found their way home. Had he somehow learned what she did back then? Or had he been there all along? Her mind spiraled deeper. She remembered the man she betrayed, Daniel Carter, her former business partner. Together, they had built a company that promised success and fame. But when things went wrong, when the money disappeared, she turned the story against him. She fabricated evidence, rewrote documents, even cried in front of the board to prove her innocence. Daniel was discredited, ruined, and eventually gone. No one knew what happened to him after that. Some said he left the country, others whispered he took his own life. But Rachel never looked back. She didn't want to know. All she cared about was that her name was cleared, and her life continued untouched. Now, sitting under the same kind of fluorescent light that once freed her, she could almost see Daniel's face in her mind, pale, broken, betrayed. And when she looked at the judge again, she caught a fleeting resemblance. The eyes, the jawline, the stillness. Her throat went dry. No, it couldn't be. The sound of the judge's gavel startled her back to the present. "Ms. Monroe," he said, "please focus on the question." His tone was sharp, controlled, but beneath it, there was something else: pain, memory, recognition. She tried to compose herself, forcing a polite nod. "Yes, Your Honor," she managed, though her voice cracked slightly. The judge's gaze lingered for a heartbeat too long before turning back to his notes. Rachel's lawyer leaned toward her, whispering, "You're fine. Stay calm. He's just testing your credibility." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling crawling down her spine. Every look the judge gave her now felt personal, deliberate. Not professional scrutiny, but something older. Deeper, Michael sat silently, watching her unravel. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew something had shifted. As the session adjourned for lunch, Rachel stood, her knees weak, her pulse racing. She dared one last glance at the judge. He was already looking at her, and this time, when their eyes met, a faint, chilling smile touched his lips. It wasn't the smile of justice. It was the smile of recognition, and suddenly, Rachel realized, Daniel Carter might not be dead after all. The courtroom resumed after lunch, but the air felt different, heavier, quieter, as if everyone sensed something had shifted. Rachel sat rigid in her chair, her fingers gripping her pen like a weapon she didn't know how to use. The sound of the ticking courtroom clock filled her head, every second scraping at her nerves. Across the room, Michael looked strangely composed now, not hopeful, but calm, as if he'd felt a wind change that she couldn't sense yet. When the judge entered, Rachel's heart gave a single hard beat. His eyes swept across the courtroom, pausing for the briefest second on her before settling on the papers before him. No words were exchanged, but she felt the meaning anyway. He remembers. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that comes before thunder. And in that silence, Rachel realized something terrifying. She was no longer in control of this story. The hearing continued, but the judge's demeanor had transformed. He was no longer distant or detached. His questions now came like small, deliberate cuts, each one aimed precisely where her story was weakest. "Ms. Monroe," he said evenly, "you seem to recall details from years ago quite vividly. Tell me, how do you manage such perfect memory?" Rachel smiled thinly. "Trauma, Your Honor. It leaves permanent marks." He leaned forward slightly. "Indeed it does." The courtroom grew still. Michael watched closely as Rachel began to falter under the steady rhythm of those questions, her composure cracking like porcelain under pressure. The judge's tone never rose, but every word carried a quiet threat, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Her lawyer shifted nervously beside her, sensing danger but not its source. "Your Honor," he interjected, "is this line of questioning relevant?" The judge smiled faintly, not cruelly but knowingly. "More than you realize, counselor." As the session neared its end, Rachel tried to breathe, but the air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Every gaze, every whisper seemed to target her now. She could feel the walls closing in, the calm precision of the judge's tone, Michael's quiet observation. the murmurs of the gallery, all of it building into a rhythm she couldn't escape. Then it happened. A small slip. When the defense lawyer asked about the date of a supposed incident, Rachel misspoke. Just a single wrong month. The judge's pen stopped mid-stroke. "Could you repeat that, Ms. Monroe?" he asked softly. Her throat went dry. I meant April." He nodded slowly. "Of course you did. It wasn't an accusation. It was confirmation." And for the first time, Rachel felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. The kind that comes when someone realizes their carefully built world is about to collapse. As court adjourned, thunder rolled faintly outside the courthouse, echoing the one brewing inside her chest. The storm hadn't struck yet, but she could already feel the first drops. Whatever this judge knew, he was done pretending he didn't. The next morning, the courtroom felt like a loaded weapon. Every glance, every whisper carried tension that hummed in the air like static. Rachel tried to appear calm, her hair perfectly arranged, her blazer immaculate, but no amount of polish could hide the tremor in her hands. The defense lawyer, a lean man with eyes like scalpels, stood up slowly, adjusting his tie before speaking. "Ms. Monroe," he began, voice smooth but sharp. "I'd like to revisit your timeline from last year." Her pulse quickened. He held up a stack of papers, neat, organized, deadly. "You testified that Mr. Hale came to your home on the 14th of April, correct?" "Yes," she said softly, eyes flicking to the judge. The lawyer smiled slightly. "Interesting. Because according to these records, you were on a flight to Chicago that same evening." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came. And behind the bench, the judge's eyes narrowed, silent, observing, almost satisfied. The cross-examination had begun, and it was going to cut deep. Her voice trembled as she tried to recover. That must be a mistake," she stammered. I was home that night." The lawyer tilted his head, pretending to consider. "A mistake, perhaps. But the airline records don't make many of those, Ms. Monroe. And this," he raised another paper, "is your hotel reservation from that same trip." "Booked under your name," Rachel's lawyer objected, his tone desperate. "Irrelevant, Your Honor." The judge lifted a hand, calm, unhurried. "Overruled. Continue." The word overruled hit Rachel like a verdict. Her heart thundered as she turned toward the judge, searching his face for fairness, for mercy. But his expression was carved from stone. He didn't need to raise his voice to dominate the room. His silence was enough. The defense lawyer leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper sharp enough for everyone to hear. "Tell me, Ms. Monroe, what else have you forgotten?" The gallery was still. The air buzzed with unease. And Rachel, once untouchable, now looked small, trapped in the very web she spun. Somewhere behind the stillness, she could feel it. The storm had begun to break. As Rachel struggled to answer, the judge's gavel struck once, not loud, but final. "That's enough for now," he said, his tone low but commanding. His eyes lingered on Rachel for a beat too long, and she could feel the weight of his unspoken judgment pressing down on her chest. But then he leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice almost gentle now, "the truth has a way of finding its way back, even when buried under layers of lies. Don't you agree?" The question was casual on the surface, but the way he said it, steady, personal, made her skin crawl. Her throat went dry. I suppose it does," she whispered. "Good," the judge said softly, setting down his pen, "because we're only getting started." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Everyone else heard a simple remark, a procedural comment. But Rachel heard something else beneath it. A promise. And as the gavel struck again, echoing through the chamber, she realized that whatever game this was, the judge wasn't playing by her rules anymore. The next day, Rachel arrived early, though she barely slept. Her eyes were shadowed, her confidence gone. The courthouse that once felt like her stage now felt like a prison, every corridor whispering her name, every glance cutting through her like a blade. She took her seat at the witness stand again, forcing herself to breathe. But something had changed. The jurors avoided her gaze. Even her lawyer's reassurances felt weak, hollow, rehearsed. When the session began, the defense continued their quiet assault, question after question, precise and merciless. Each one unraveled a thread from the story she had so carefully woven. "You said you called the police immediately, correct?" the lawyer asked. "Yes," she replied quickly. "And yet," he said, holding up a report, "no record of that call exists." Her pulse hammered in her throat. She opened her mouth to protest, but her voice faltered. The room's silence pressed in like walls closing around her, and from the bench, the judge's gaze never moved. Rachel felt her first real tremor of fear, not of losing the case, but of being seen. By noon, Rachel's mask had begun to shatter. Her calm words broke under the pressure, her eyes darting between faces like a cornered animal. "Maybe I'm misremembering," she said weakly. "It was months ago Of course," the lawyer said smoothly. "Memory can be unreliable." He paused, turning toward the jury. "Especially when it serves one's interest." A faint murmur ran through the gallery. Rachel gripped the edges of her chair so tightly her knuckles whitened. The judge's pen tapped softly, not impatiently, but rhythmically, almost as if keeping count of her unraveling. She risked a glance at Michael. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He only looked at her, not with hatred, but with something worse. Pity. That look pierced her deeper than any accusation. And as the prosecutor tried to redirect the narrative, her mind began to spiral. Why is no one believing me anymore? What changed? Then, almost without realizing it, she turned toward the judge again. And there it was, that faint, knowing look. The one that said, "I'm not just hearing your lies. I've heard them before." The afternoon dragged on, each minute heavier than the last. The defense's final question came quietly, deceptively simple. "Ms. Monroe," the lawyer said, "is there anything about your past you haven't disclosed to this court?" Her breath caught. The question wasn't about this case. It was a test. A door opening toward something far more dangerous. I don't think so," she whispered. The lawyer smiled faintly. "Good. Because honesty, as they say, always finds its way out." The judge leaned forward slightly, resting his chin on his folded hands. His eyes glimmered with a subtle, almost imperceptible recognition, as if waiting for her to remember what he already knew. The courtroom lights flickered for a moment, and the soft hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence. The storm outside had grown darker, wind howling faintly against the glass windows. And in that dim, electric quiet, Rachel finally realized that her biggest lie wasn't what she told the court. It was what she'd told herself, that the past could stay buried forever. The judge lowered his eyes to his notes, but the faintest smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The threads were breaking, and soon there'd be nothing left to hold the mask together. The next morning arrived gray and heavy. The air inside the courthouse felt damp, like the walls themselves were sweating with secrets. Rachel entered quietly, her posture tense, every step echoing through the marble floor like a countdown. She tried not to meet anyone's eyes. Her confidence was gone. What replaced it was a fragile shell of someone who once believed she could control her own story. The judge entered a few minutes later, calm as ever. His gavel struck once, a sound that cut through the tension like thunder in a church. "We'll begin," he said, voice steady. "The defense may proceed." Michael's lawyer stood, holding something in a sealed plastic sleeve. He didn't speak right away. He simply looked at Rachel, then at the jury. The silence stretched, until even the hum of the ceiling lights became deafening. Finally he spoke. "Your Honor, we have new evidence. Something that sheds light on Ms. Monroe's credibility." Rachel's heart skipped. The lawyer turned the sleeve around, and for the first time, everyone saw it. A photograph. Old, faded, and terrible in its clarity, and though the image was grainy, Rachel knew it instantly. Her breath caught like a sob swallowed too late. It was her, but not the version sitting here today. The photo was projected onto the screen, huge, glowing across the courtroom wall. It showed a younger Rachel standing beside a man in a dimly lit bar. The man's face was bruised, his expression fearful. Rachel's hand was gripping his collar. Behind them, a mirror reflected another face. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Rachel froze, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. "That's not," she began, her voice cracking. "That's not what it looks like." But even she could hear the desperation in her tone. The defense lawyer stepped forward, voice calm. "Ms. Monroe, this photograph was taken 8 years ago, in a town where you claimed never to have lived. The man beside you, Jacob Raines, was later found dead. Case unsolved." Her knees weakened. She gripped the stand, the world spinning. "I didn't kill him," she whispered. "Who said anything about killing?" He replied softly. "I said the case was unsolved." The jury stared, wide-eyed and silent. The judge remained perfectly still, his hands folded, his gaze locked on her. Only now there was no neutrality in his expression. There was memory, and then Rachel understood. The judge hadn't just seen the photo before. He had been there. Rachel's breath turned shallow. Every corner of the room felt alive, pulsing with judgment, whispers, ghosts of the past crawling out of the photograph. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering urgently, "Don't say anything. We can contest the evidence," but she barely heard him. Her gaze was fixed on the judge. He stared back, silent, almost sorrowful. The faintest shake of his head told her what she didn't want to believe. He remembered, the courtroom blurred. The sound of the rain outside grew louder, a wild tapping against the windows like frantic fingers begging to get in. Rachel's hands trembled. "That photo was a mistake," she said weakly. "It was years ago. I didn't mean Ms. Monroe," the judge interrupted softly, his tone colder now. "You're under oath. Are you certain you want to continue down this path?" The lights flickered again. The power hummed, and in that brief darkness, Rachel felt the full weight of her undoing. When the lights returned, her face was pale, her eyes hollow. The courtroom was still, waiting for her answer, but she said nothing. The photo, still glowing on the wall, told the story for her. The silence after the photograph felt eternal, the kind that swallows sound and breath together. Rachel sat motionless, her fingers twitching on the wooden stand. The judge's eyes didn't leave her, not even for a second. And then, slowly, he reached for a folder on his desk. 8 years ago, he began, voice calm but heavy. A case was dismissed. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence was buried. He paused, letting his gaze pierce her. The name on that file was Jacob Raines. Rachel's throat tightened. I don't know what you mean. The judge exhaled quietly, like someone who had waited years for this moment. "Yes, you do. You were called Rachel Hines back then. You changed your name after the trial." The courtroom gasped. Her lawyer froze, turning to her in disbelief. "Rachel, what is he talking about?" She couldn't answer. Because it was true. And for the first time, the truth didn't just threaten her career. It threatened her entire existence. The judge leaned back, eyes unfocused, as though seeing ghosts only he could recognize. The courtroom faded for him, replaced by a night long ago, rain pouring on broken asphalt. A small-town bar at closing time. A young man, Jacob Raines, begging for help. And a woman standing under a flickering streetlight, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "I remember that night," the judge said softly, his voice distant but trembling. "I was a junior prosecutor then. Jacob came to me, terrified. Said he had evidence that could destroy a company. And a woman named Rachel Hines. The next morning, he was dead." Rachel's lips parted, her breath shaky. "You have no proof I did anything." The judge's gaze hardened. "No, but I saw you that night. You were standing across the street, watching the police tape, smiling. A chill ran through every person in the courtroom. The storm outside grew louder, thunder rolling like a verdict waiting to be spoken. Rachel felt her chest tighten, panic clawing at her throat. "You're lying," she hissed. "You're making this up because I accused someone powerful." But even as she said it, she knew the words were hollow. Her voice cracked. Her lawyer stood to object, but the judge raised a hand. "Sit down, counselor," he said coldly. "This is no longer just about testimony. This is about truth." The courtroom fell silent again. Rachel's world was collapsing, each lie she had built now cracking open like fragile glass. Every whisper in the gallery felt like judgment. Every breath she took sounded like guilt. Michael, still seated quietly, stared at her, not with anger now, but with pity. And that made it worse. "Tell me," the judge said, his tone barely above a whisper. "When you stood on that stand years ago and lied to protect yourself, did you ever imagine you'd face me again?" Her eyes widened, trembling with disbelief. "You," she stammered, "you were that prosecutor?" He nodded once. And in that moment, the courtroom didn't feel like a place of law anymore. It felt like a haunting. The past had come back wearing a black robe. And Rachel Monroe was no longer the accuser. She was the condemned. That night, long after everyone had left, the judge sat alone in his chambers. The clock ticked faintly, the sound echoing against the cold marble walls. His desk lamp cast a single cone of yellow light across a stack of old papers, worn, stained, and sealed in dust. Files that should have been forgotten. Files that someone had tried to erase. He unlocked the bottom drawer and slid out a brown folder marked Case No. 2214, J. Raines. The corners were brittle, the ink faded. He hadn't opened it in 8 years. Not since the night Rachel, then Hines, walked free while a young man's body was zipped into a bag behind a bar. His fingers trembled as he opened the file. Inside were photographs, a police report, and one item that made his blood run cold, a torn letter. Half burned, written in Jacob's handwriting. It read, "If anything happens to me, she knows why." He closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. "You thought you buried it," he whispered into the quiet. "But you left ghosts behind, Rachel." A faint creak echoed from the corridor, someone moving outside his office. He looked up sharply. The hallway was empty. Still, he locked the file away again. The storm outside was growing wilder, and he could feel that something, or someone, was about to break. At the same time, Rachel sat in her dark apartment, pacing. Her reflection in the window looked almost like a stranger, pale, wild-eyed, and trembling. The city lights outside blurred through the rain, streaking down the glass like tears. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. It rang once, twice. Then a gravelly voice answered. "You shouldn't be calling me, Rachel." Her voice was shaking. They found the photo. And the judge, he knows. "It's him." The line went quiet. Then the voice said, "If he remembers, it's too late." He was there that night. "You can't talk your way out of this." She gritted her teeth, whispering harshly, "Then I'll find another way." But the call ended before she could say more. The silence that followed was louder than thunder. She dropped the phone and sank to the floor, breathing fast. The rain outside slammed harder against the window, like the world itself was warning her. In that moment, she realized something she hadn't before. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with unease. The judge entered quietly, but the weight of the night before followed him. He looked at Rachel, not with hatred, but with the sorrow of a man who had seen too much. Before the session began, he opened a small, sealed envelope and placed it before him. Inside was the same torn letter from Jacob Raines's file. He tapped his pen once against the bench. "Miss Monroe," he said evenly, "I came across an old document. Perhaps you could help me clarify something." Rachel's stomach twisted. "What document?" He slid the letter forward. The words, though half burned, were still visible. "She knows why," her eyes widened. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, voice cracking. "It never truly disappeared," the judge said softly, just like the truth. Every sound in the courtroom seemed to vanish. Even the rain outside had stopped, as if the world itself was holding its breath. For the first time, Rachel didn't speak, didn't argue, because she recognized the handwriting, and she knew what that meant. The dead had begun to speak. The courtroom blurred in Rachel's mind as the letter's image burned behind her eyes. She could still see Jacob's handwriting, shaky but familiar, the ink smeared by what looked like tears or rain. Her breathing grew shallow, and before she could stop herself, her mind slipped backward, dragging her into a memory she'd buried years ago. It was a stormy night, just like this one. The rain had soaked through her coat as she stood outside that same small-town bar. The neon sign flickered red and white, reflecting in the puddles like bleeding light. Inside, Jacob sat hunched over a drink, glancing nervously toward the door every few seconds. Rachel walked in quietly, her heels clicking on the floor. "You shouldn't have called me," she said, sitting across from him. He looked broken, scared in a way that made her uneasy. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. "You said it was just about money, but now there's someone following me." "I'm done, Rachel. I'm going to the police." She smiled faintly, her eyes cold. "Jacob, you don't want to do that," but he did. And that was the problem. The memory sharpened, clearer now, painful in its detail. She followed Jacob out into the rain, her umbrella useless against the wind. He turned to her under the streetlight, his voice trembling. "You think you can control everything, but you can't hide forever." "They'll find out," Rachel's patience snapped. "You don't understand what's at stake," she shouted. "You'll ruin everything." He stepped back, shaking his head. "You're not the person I thought you were." For a moment, she saw real fear in his eyes, and something inside her broke. She reached for him, desperate to stop him from walking away. There was a struggle, a shove. His foot slipped on the wet pavement, then the sound. A sickening crack as his head struck the edge of the curb. Rachel froze, rainwater washing over her shoes as Jacob fell motionless to the ground. The light above them flickered again, stuttering like a dying heartbeat. She knelt beside him, whispering, "Jacob! Jacob, get up!" But he didn't move. The rain drowned out everything. The sirens, the footsteps, even her sobs. And then she saw him, a young man standing across the street, under a broken umbrella, staring at her in shock. The prosecutor, the man who would one day become the judge. Rachel gasped, her vision snapping back to the courtroom. Her hands were shaking violently now. Everyone was staring at her, but all she could see was his face that night, drenched in rain and disbelief. "You were there," she whispered, staring at the judge. "You saw it happen." His eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, and I remember what you said after. You looked at me and told me it was an accident." Tears welled in her eyes. "It was an accident." "Maybe," he said quietly. "But you let someone else take the blame. You lied on the stand. You watched a man go to prison for what you did." Her lips trembled. "I had no choice." The judge's tone darkened, colder now. "There's always a choice. You just chose yourself." The courtroom was utterly silent. No one dared move. The truth, after years of decay, had finally clawed its way to the surface. Rachel lowered her head into her hands, whispering through broken sobs. It was supposed to end that night. The judge looked down at her, eyes shadowed. "No," he said softly. "It's ending now." The air in the courtroom was so still that every breath seemed to echo. Rachel sat trembling in the witness box, eyes wide, face drained of all color. Her hands clutched the edge of the table as if it could keep her from collapsing. She wanted to scream, to run, to erase everything. But the walls around her felt alive, closing in with every heartbeat. The judge's voice broke through the silence, low and deliberate. "You've spent years lying, Ms. Monroe. You lied to save yourself and again to destroy another man's life. The truth was never yours to twist." She lifted her gaze, tears pooling in her eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I did what I had to. If I hadn't—" The judge slammed the gavel once. The sharp crack echoed like thunder. "Enough!" The word struck harder than the sound. It wasn't anger in his voice, it was finality. And for the first time, Rachel felt something inside her begin to fracture. Not her story. Her mind, her breathing grew ragged. "You think you're righteous?" She shouted suddenly, her voice breaking. "You think you know pain? You weren't the one who was threatened, used, cornered. You didn't live every day wondering when it would all fall apart." The jury flinched at the sudden outburst. The defense lawyer tried to calm her, whispering urgently, "Rachel, stop! You're making it worse!" She ignored him, her voice rising. "I didn't mean for him to die. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Her words trembled, splintering into sobs. "It wasn't supposed to go that far." The judge watched in silence, his face unreadable, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, pity mixed with grief. He had seen this before, the breaking point. "Ms. Monroe," he said quietly, "you've lived in the shadow of your own lies for too long. The truth was never going to stay buried. It always finds a way back." Rachel shook her head violently, tears streaking her face. "No, you don't get to judge me. You saw it. You could have stopped it that night." The courtroom gasped. The words hung in the air like poison. The judge's face darkened, the truth of her accusation visible only for a heartbeat, before he hid it again behind duty. Rachel's voice cracked into silence. For a moment, no one spoke. The sound of rain outside returned, soft and distant, like a slow funeral march. Her body trembled, the weight of everything finally crashing down. She sank back into her seat, whispering, "I just wanted to live. I didn't mean for it to end like this." The judge closed his eyes. "It never ends the way we plan," he murmured. Her lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder, but she barely noticed. Her mind was unraveling. Every memory, every lie, every scream from that night bleeding back into one endless storm. The world tilted. Her breaths came faster, shorter, desperate. The judge called for a recess, but before anyone could move, Rachel stood up, swaying. "You think I can't pay for what I did?" she said faintly. "I already have." Then she collapsed, her body crumpling to the floor as gasps erupted through the courtroom. Papers scattered, the gavel fell, and chaos replaced the silence. As paramedics rushed in, the judge remained frozen on his bench, staring down at the woman who once ruined lives, and her own. The sound of rain against the windows grew louder again, relentless and cold. In that moment, everyone understood. Justice had already begun. Rachel woke to the sterile hum of hospital lights. The faint beeping of a heart monitor pulsed beside her, slow and rhythmic, like a reminder that she was still alive, though part of her wished she wasn't. Her wrists trembled as she reached for the blanket, the chill of the room biting through her skin. For a moment, she thought she was alone, but then she saw him. The judge stood near the doorway, his robe gone, replaced by a gray suit. Without the courtroom around him, he looked older and sadder. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. He hesitated before stepping closer. "Because I couldn't let it end like that." Rachel let out a shaky laugh that dissolved into a cough. "End like what?" "The truth's already out. You saw what I did, what I became." He looked at her for a long time. "I also saw who you were before all this, before the lies consumed you." She turned away, tears filling her eyes. "That person died the night Jacob did." For the first time, he didn't argue. He just nodded, slowly, heavily, because he knew it was true. Rachel's voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak. "You want to know why I lied back then?" The judge didn't move, his silence giving her permission. "I was scared," she said. "Not of the police. Not even of you. I was scared of the people behind Jacob's secret. He wasn't just blackmailing me, he was blackmailing someone powerful. I told him to stop, but he didn't listen. That night when he fell," her breath hitched. "It wasn't just an accident. Someone else was there too," the judge frowned. "Someone else?" She nodded weakly. "A man in a dark coat. I thought he worked for them. When Jacob hit the ground, that man told me to leave, to disappear, or I'd end up like him." The judge's jaw tightened. "You're saying there was a cover-up?" Rachel's voice cracked. "I didn't know who to trust, so I lied. I let an innocent man take the blame because I thought I'd be next." She covered her face, sobbing. "And every night since then I've heard Jacob's voice, in the rain, in my dreams, in the silence." The judge turned away, his hands trembling slightly. It wasn't just justice haunting them anymore. It was guilt, shared and unspoken. When Rachel finally looked up, her tears had stopped. There was nothing left in her eyes now but exhaustion and strange relief. You were right, she said softly. Truth doesn't stay buried, it rots. It seeps into everything until it poisons you from the inside. The judge stepped closer. You could have come forward years ago, she smiled bitterly. And you could have stopped me that night. But you didn't, did you? He froze. The accusation was quiet but piercing, and true. He had hesitated that night. He'd seen the blood, the fear, and instead of intervening, he'd walked away, letting the system handle what his conscience couldn't. Now both of them lived in the ruins of that decision. Rachel's voice softened to a whisper. You and we both let him die. The words cut through the air, heavy and final. The heart monitor beeped faster for a moment, matching the tension that filled the room. The judge looked down, his face pale, and murmured, Then maybe we both deserve what's coming. Outside, thunder rolled again, deep, mournful, endless. The storm had never really left. It had just been waiting for this moment. Days later, the courthouse stood under a gray morning sky. The air was thick with tension. Reporters swarming outside, murmuring about the case that had turned into a national storm. Inside, everything felt slower, heavier, as if time itself was waiting to see how justice would fall. Rachel entered the courtroom in handcuffs, escorted by 2 officers. Her face was pale but calm now. No more trembling, no more outbursts. The fear was gone, replaced by something colder, acceptance. She glanced at the judge's bench and saw him sitting there once again, the black robe draped over the same man who had once been her ghost. The crowd hushed as the gavel struck. This hearing, the judge said quietly, will determine whether Ms. Rachel Monroe's perjury charges will stand and whether further proceedings regarding the death of Jacob Raines will be reopened. Every word carried weight. Even Rachel flinched. She whispered under her breath, You should have let me die in that hospital. The judge's gaze lifted. And let the truth die with you? No, Ms. Monroe, not this time. The silence that followed was deafening. The calm before the final storm. As the testimonies resumed, it became clear that this wasn't a trial about one woman anymore. It was about what everyone in that room had done, or failed to do. Witnesses spoke. Lawyers argued. But the real battle was silent, happening between 2 people who could barely look at each other. Rachel's lawyer made a final plea. She's guilty of lying, yes, but she's also a product of fear, of a system that protects power and punishes weakness. The judge's hand tightened around the gavel. His mind raced with echoes of that night, his younger self standing under the rain, too afraid to act. He remembered Jacob's body, the blood in the gutter, Rachel's haunted face. He had told himself back then that he couldn't interfere, that it wasn't his place. But deep down, he had known the truth. He'd walked away to protect his own career. Now, fate had dragged him back to the same moment, demanding an answer. Rachel looked up at him suddenly, eyes meeting his. For the first time, her voice was steady. You're not just judging me, she said softly. You're judging yourself. Her words hit him like a knife. The courtroom blurred. For a fleeting second, he imagined himself stepping down, confessing everything, telling the truth about that night. But that would mean destroying more lives, including hers. He swallowed hard, the weight of justice pressing against the weight of mercy. And for the first time in his career, he didn't know which side he stood on. The room fell silent as he rose to speak. His voice, though calm, trembled at the edges. This court has seen lies, he said, and truths buried so deep that even time couldn't hold them back. What happened years ago cannot be undone. But today, we can choose what becomes of it. Rachel's eyes glistened. So what's my punishment? She whispered. The judge looked down at her for a long moment. Then slowly he said, Your punishment began the night you lied, and it's been with you ever since. He set the gavel down, gently this time. I'm ordering a full reinvestigation into the death of Jacob Raines. As for the perjury charges, his pause lingered long enough for hearts to stop beating. Ms. Monroe will be remanded to custody until further notice. Rachel's shoulders sagged, a faint sigh escaping her lips. Not fear, not anger. Relief. because in that single sentence, she knew he had done what she couldn't, faced the truth. As she was led away, she turned to him one last time. "You could have saved him," she whispered. "But maybe now, you saved something else." The judge watched her go, his reflection flickering in the courtroom glass like a ghost half freed from its own chains. Outside, the storm finally began to fade, but the air still smelled of rain and regret. Nights in prison were colder than Rachel imagined. Not because of the walls or the steel bars, but because of the quiet. The kind of quiet that made memories echo louder than screams. Every sound, the drip of water, the shuffle of guards, the faint hum of distant lights, became reminders of her past. She lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling where the moonlight traced faint, broken lines across the cracks. The trial was over, but something still lingered, unfinished, unspoken. It wasn't justice she craved anymore. It was release. For the first time in years, her thoughts weren't about revenge or fear. They were about truth, and the man who had once watched her from the shadows of that rainy night. The same man who now sat behind the judge's bench, burdened by his own sins. She sat up, reached for the small piece of paper the guard had left, and whispered, "Maybe the truth doesn't set us free. Maybe it just stops us from running." Her pen scratched across the page, slow, trembling, deliberate. Each word felt like a confession, each sentence a blade slicing through the silence. When she folded the letter, she smiled faintly for the first time. Not out of peace, but because she finally knew what had to be said. It was late evening when the letter reached the judge's office. The sky outside was a bruised mix of orange and gray, the color of endings. He sat alone at his desk, tie loosened, glasses resting beside a stack of unfinished reports. When the clerk brought in the envelope, he didn't need to ask who it was from. Her handwriting was delicate, almost fragile, the kind of script that trembled between guilt and grace. He hesitated before opening it, tracing his fingers over his name written on the front. Then slowly he unfolded the paper. "You once said justice comes when truth stands alone, but I think truth only lives when someone dares to carry it, even when it burns. I carried mine too long and it destroyed everything I touched. I lied to save myself, but all I did was kill what little of me was still alive. You were there that night. I saw you watching from the other side of the street. You didn't stop it, and I didn't confess it. Maybe that's why fate tied us together. Not to punish us, but to make sure we never forget what silence costs." His breath caught. His hands shook as he read those words again and again, the ink blurring under his eyes. The world outside faded until there was only the soft creak of his chair and the whisper of paper. Rachel's words had reached him deeper than any verdict could. They weren't an accusation, they were a mirror. And for the first time, he saw the man behind the robe, flawed, frightened, and unbearably human. That night, rain returned, steady, relentless, like a memory trying to wash the world clean. The judge stood at the courthouse steps long after everyone had gone home, holding the letter tightly in his hand. The drops smudged the ink, but he didn't care. He read it again under the dim streetlight, the same corner where it had all begun years ago. He whispered to the night, "You saw me all this time." In the distance, the city lights shimmered, reflecting off the wet pavement, just like that night when Jacob fell and Rachel screamed. The ghosts had never left. They'd only been waiting for him to listen. He knelt on the cold concrete, closed his eyes, and let the rain hit his face. Hard, unforgiving, cleansing. Somewhere deep inside, something cracked open. The weight he had carried for years, the secret, the guilt, the fear, began to dissolve into the sound of falling rain. He took a breath and spoke softly, as if answering her letter. "Maybe you're right, Rachel. The truth doesn't free us. It just stops us from running." And as the thunder rolled across the city, the last of his silence broke, carried away with the rain into the night that had witnessed it all. They say lies can buy time, but never peace. Rachel's words once ruled the courtroom, but silence became her verdict. Michael moved on, carrying scars only he could see, while the judge carried memories that no sentence could erase. In the end, justice didn't roar, it whispered. It came not through revenge, but through revelation. Because when truth hides, it doesn't disappear, it waits. And when it finally returns, it doesn't knock, it enters. The gavel fell once that day, but its echo lived on, a reminder that every lie has an expiration date. Some call it karma, others call it fate, but in that courtroom, they simply called it justice.